Hello and welcome to Choose Up Fi. Today on the show, we have two of my really good friends. We have Jen and Jill from the Frugal Friends podcast, and they have a new book coming out on January 7th called Buy What You Love Without Going Broke. This book is really fantastic, and it dives into just a ton of critical areas that I think all of us need to consider. It's that tension between overspending and ultra frugality. It's trying to find out, what do you value in life, and how to actually undertake experiments to figure out, hey, what do I want my life to look like? And maybe some really specific actionable takeaways on 30-day no spend challenges or 90-day transaction inventories. So this episode has a little bit of everything, from the really, really hyper actionable to the broad aspects of, hey, FI is a journey. It's a constantly evolving life. And we need to be there for that journey with an open mind. I think you're really, really going to enjoy this episode. And with that, welcome to Choose Up Fi. All right, Jen and Jill, two of my absolute favorite people. I love having you on the show. This is going to be fun.
We love being here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, this is going to be cool. So, okay, in a week, you have a book coming out called Buy What You Love Without Going Broke. Transform your spending and get more of what money can't buy. And I think what's so interesting about you two is obviously you are the Frugal Friends. And I think it is a reframe on frugality in the best possible way. And I think frugality has taken a lot of hits over the last handful of years, even in our community. And we are the frugal community, right? But we've gone so far away from it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on maybe why that's happened. Why have we gone away from frugality so much?
So you're saying like people have been anti-frugality at this point and pro making lots of money?
In terms of the general sentiment behind frugality.
So I think we love to operate in extremes, and black and white. It's just easier to navigate with as little nuance as possible. That's just like how our brains work, right? So for me, my husband and I paid off $78,000 of debt in 2 years. And once we were done with that, I thought my financial problems, insecurities, fears were just going to go away. And they didn't. And so instead of navigating why that was, I just decided to jump into FI and put the same amount that I was putting towards debt into 401k, IRA, and just go the same, like full steam ahead with FI. And then I got let go from my job 7 weeks before I had my first son. And I no longer could go full steam ahead. And I was forced to try to navigate some of this nuance between, why did I feel like I needed to go full steam ahead? And that led to starting my own financial writing business. And I really got started with, okay, I'll just make as much money as possible. Then I won't have to think about all of the spending, which is hilarious because, a year later I started Frugal Friends and I was Modern Frugality. So I was thinking more about the saving money aspect, but there was still in my own personal life this disconnect. I just wanted to navigate in the black or white, in the extremes, because it was easier. I didn't have to think about why these things were hard, why I felt guilty when I spent money, why I felt so fearful when I spent money because I didn't know if I was going to need it down the road. And so I think that's why we see these pendulum swings in the FI community between ultra frugality extreme and ultra income earning extreme. I think that's why we've also seen so many flavors of FI in these different degrees. People want to label themselves FI, but they're starting to find their radical middle, their balance between the extremes, and giving them new labels, which I think is amazing because people are starting to embrace the nuance and try to navigate it.
Yeah, I love that embracing of the nuance. I can't keep up with all the flavors of FI.
I know, right?
The host of the Choose Up Fi podcast. It's utterly ridiculous.
I can't either, but I'm just if you've found a label for yourself that you love, I love that for you.
I love cookies and cream ice cream. I don't need the bacon and pistachio flavor. They did it well the first time.
Exactly. And Jill, you've talked in the past before about the tension of living in the middle of these extremes, the extremes that Jen was talking about. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that because I just think this is so critical for all of us.
Yeah. This is what we call the radical middle between Jen and I think our community has kind of picked up this term. Radical because not many people venture there. We are drawn to extremes, and sometimes we do visit those extremes, but we are really advocating for holding the tension between the two. So recognizing what's good on this side of maybe high income earning and what's good on the other side of maybe ultra extreme frugality, and taking from both ends and holding it in the middle. So not expelling everything from one side or the other. That's where we then find ourselves in an extreme that eventually we're going to burn out from, but rather finding what works for us from both sides and creating our kind of own individualized, again, radical middle of, yeah, I like this, but not that aspect of it. Yes, I do want to earn more, but not just for the sake of earning more. I want to be able to define my enough and what that looks like in my season. And I also want to practice good stewardship of my resources, which is going to look like frugality in some ways of conscious consumption of I actually don't need to buy all of the paper products, or I don't actually need to get a ton of decor. And for some, that may look like deprivation. But for me, I have found I don't need all of those things. I found other solutions, but I will absolutely say yes to spending on travel. And so it's this give and take and holding the tension rather than saying, I'm going to just stay here, stay planted here because this is what I've been told to do, and never questioning it or identifying, could there be other things that are beneficial to me here?
As always, when you talk, I have like 45 things that I want to talk about. It's so frustrating. So first comes to mind, we're going to talk about all these, but life is an experiment, right? Trying to figure out what you actually like. Minimalism is something that is near and dear to my heart, and it's becoming much more so. So I definitely want to talk about that. But let's go back to this radical middle and maybe like specific nuts and bolts steps on how people can find this. Because I think, frankly, and you two talk about this in your book, like we live in an ultra consumerist society, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have been basically, our dopamine centers have been hijacked very intelligently by many of these companies, and it is hard to get out of that trap. So maybe we talk a little bit about dopamine, but maybe then we also talk about how do we find that radical middle, like actual like experiments. How do we do this? What's the methodology? So let's see if we can kind of jump off from there on those two topics. I know they sound wildly disparate maybe to the audience, but I think they are inextricably linked.
So connected. Okay, so between dopamine and the radical middle. This isn't like the first step that I usually give, but I'll like dive into this because it's one of my favorites. It's a no spend challenge. And I've been talking about no spend challenges since, I did my first one in college out of necessity, but my first intentional one for financial reasons was while we were paying off debt. And I did it just to save money. But what I learned, what I got from it, it extended far beyond the extra $300 or $400 it saved me. And what I really learned was that it forced me to take space, to hold space, to figure out creative alternatives to meet my wants and needs. And that was what I thought was really interesting, because when you can just solve all your problems by throwing money at them, and I'm not even talking about big things, but like I'm having a bad day and I want a little treat, so I'm going to get myself a little coffee, like that is, we're throwing money at a problem instead of forcing ourselves to get creative with how we meet the need. Do we deserve a little treat? Absolutely. Every day, multiple times a day. But let's make sure that they are real treats and not just poor, easy excuses for treats because it's just so easy to throw money at problems. So a no spend challenge for 30 days requires you at least, there are a lot of nuances even in that, but overarching requires you to not spend money on discretionary expenses for 30 days, 1 month. You could do it longer, but I think if we're learning how to spend money well, you only need 30 days. If you're trying to learn how to not spend money, you can do it for as long as you want. But we want to help people learn how to spend money without guilt, shame, or going broke. And so what that does is it takes off all the decisions that you make throughout the day that ask, do I want to buy this or do I not want to buy this? Because the answer is no. So you've got less decision fatigue. You've got less dopamine spike. Dr. Ann Lemke wrote a book called Dopamine Nation, and she helps people with all kinds of addictions, all involving dopamine. And she saw after 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks were the hardest for her patients that were doing dopamine fasts. After 4 weeks, though, her patients, excluding, drug and alcohol and physical addictions, but her patients after 4 weeks of abstaining from their dopamine eliciting addiction really did see substantial results and differences in how much dopamine was released or absorbed after they were encountering that addiction, quote unquote. And so we think that 4 weeks is a really good amount of time. And that is an extreme. If we're going to, by definition, a no-spend challenge is extreme. But it's by visiting these extremes that we can find our radical middle. So if we're living in this, we either spend money on whatever we want without thinking, or we spend no money out of fear, and we go to this intentional other extreme where we are thinking about our spending decisions more or less, in some cases. After a month, we are more close to whatever that radical middle is going to be. So that's just like a physical way that you can kind of get closer.
That all makes sense. So, right, these really are quite tied together. So in essence, you're taking this dopamine fast as part of this 30-day challenge. So you're teaching yourself, all right, put that little bit of space between stimulus and response, right? So that's the Viktor Frankl quote, which is just so exceedingly powerful. Okay, I like this. This is making a heck of a lot of sense to me as I'm thinking through it, right? Can we take a step back? So Jill, for a lot of people who aren't aware of dopamine or what's going on, like, is there a high level overview we can direct them to? Or like, what are your thoughts on like, hey, what's even going on here? Why, or like a lot of people might not have ever heard of this neurotransmitter, I guess is probably what it is.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Dopamine Nation by Ann Lemke would be a great resource to look into.
We'll put that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah. And we don't talk extensively about kind of the neurological aspect of dopamine, just recognizing that it is what is released when we go to make a purchase. Usually the excitement leading up to a purchase, not even necessarily when we actually pull the trigger on the thing. There's usually then a little bit of a letdown that happens, but we can become drawn to this because of what it does for our bodies. But there are a lot of ways, and this isn't to repel dopamine. It's an amazing thing that our body releases, and it's the feel-good hormone. We love it. But there are plenty of other ways that we can engage and experience a dopamine release that doesn't end up costing us a ton of money. And so one of the things, speaking of life experiments, that we will recommend people do is to make a list of alternatives that they can engage in to shopping. And we like to talk about small, medium, big exchanges. If you are one who wants to shop on your phone late at night scrolling, it's not going to be a great exchange to say, well, I'm going to go out for a run because it's midnight and that's not what's going to happen.
And it's winter.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But maybe it means that you're going to play a fun free game on your phone, or you're going to get out some stationery and write a letter to a friend. There are plenty of other free alternatives that can help us connect with maybe the deeper need that is happening.
Yeah. Okay. This I love and I want to really dive into. Maybe we can just have a conversation about this because I think so creative alternatives and life is an experiment. What do you really want? These are so critical. And I think the way that I look at life now, especially in terms of travel and trying to figure out like, what does a future life look like is I'm just experimenting. Like every time I go on a trip, specifically a trip, but it can also frankly just be in your local area. Obviously it's trying to get a little bit closer to what do I want my perfect life to be? And obviously understanding there's no perfect life, right? Let's be clear. But what can I set up as an environment? What lights me up? So in terms of even just something as simple as I went on this big trip to Bali recently. So for the 5 Freedom Retreat, I went to Bali and Singapore and Doha, which was just the most amazing trip. And it was fascinating because I think Bali, a lot of people think of as the connotations in Americans' heads are like, it's this perfect paradise. And the honest answer is, it's not a perfect paradise.
I went to Bali and got sick, like for most of the trip.
Oh, yeah. Did you have Bali belly? Is what it's affectionately known? Yeah.
So you said that, I was like,
Yeah, I think that pretty much plagued everybody. But, and this is not to denigrate Bali, because Bali, there's a lot of amazing, amazing things. But just for me, it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. There were aspects of it. So again, it's like you kind of pick and choose, and then you put life experiences together, right? Like when I visited London a handful of years ago, and we were 100 yards off of like the high street in this little Chiswick suburb. And it was like, oh, you mean I can walk to restaurants and the grocery store in a minute or two? And that's just part of the pitter patter of life, if you will. Or when I was here in Bali, yeah, we were on a resort, but it was only 100 yards off the main street. And there were 25 restaurants within a couple hundred yards. And that was just really cool. But there was nowhere to walk because the sidewalks are very limited, because the infrastructure is limited, right? So it's like, again, life is an experiment, right? It's like you pick and choose. And it's like, okay, now I realize like this is important to me that I wouldn't have assumed. This is important to me that maybe I would have assumed, but I didn't realize just how important. So like, that's how I think about it. But I'd love to hear you two talk through this in your own lives and how you think about life as an experiment.
Yeah, it's a great mindset to have, essential mindset, because so often we will try to replicate somebody else's like version of what looks like fulfillment. And then it doesn't work out. Like it doesn't make us feel like we thought it would, and then give up because, okay, well, what works doesn't work for me. So I'm just going to go back to, whatever I was doing before. But truly like looking at, and we say like, playing around, like playing with different solutions. Once you give yourself space to get creative, and creativity is something we talk about a lot because we talk about values-based spending a lot, and how we derive those values are from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And right at the very top is self-actualization, self-fulfillment, but creativity is also in that very top spot. So we have an innate need to be creative, and not just like arts and crafts and stuff, but really being creative in problem solving, solutions, in how we're living our life every day. If we feel like we are coming up with innovative solutions to old problems, even the smallest, like that makes us feel good. So when we give ourselves space to do that, to get creative in how we're creating this really fulfilling life or whatever version of perfect life you want, I mean, you start impulse spending a lot less, because no manufacturer can tell you, I have the solution to your problem and you can just buy it, because you're like, actually, that maybe is a problem. Let me get creative in how I solve it. Or, I don't actually think it's a problem for me. I think you're wrong. Maybe it's a problem for someone else, but not for me.
And the context for creativity are the parameters that we decide. And maybe the parameters that have been decided for us, of course, our income and resources and current living situation are parameters. It doesn't mean that we can't shift what those look like, but rather than bucking against them and thinking, oh, if I just made more money, then I wouldn't have to deal with this constraint, but rather looking at it as, what if this constraint provided the context for my creativity? What might I choose instead to be able to solve for whatever problem it is that I'm facing in a more creative way? That was the case for my husband and I when we were living on a very small income. I'm a social worker, and my job out of college was not paying a ton of money. And we weren't paying a ton for housing, but we just weren't able to make big strides in paying off my student loan debt. And so recognizing that housing is one of our biggest expenses, we decided to move into an RV. And we lived in 2 different RVs for 2 years. And we saved incredibly on our living expenses. And not to mention, we were able to sell the RVs at a profit because we renovated them and made them look really nice. So I was able to then cash flow my master's degree. And I'm not saying that's what everybody needs to do, but my limited income created the context for what we could then solve for, because I didn't want to go find a new job. I did really enjoy what I was doing. It felt fulfilling. So what else could we do? And that's what worked for us.
Yeah. And we're also not saying everybody's limitation has to be income
Exactly.
either. It can be other self-imposed parameters for creativity.
But that's what the 30-day no spend challenge is too. It's a self-imposed constraint that could allow for creativity to flourish, where normally I'm going to go buy to solve this problem. Now I got to think through what would I want to do instead, and sometimes find better solutions, where I might normally just go shopping at the mall and pick whatever stands out to me. Instead, I'm calling up a friend and we're going for a walk, and I'm learning more things about them, and I'm able to share of myself. And actually, that met my needs a whole lot more than a new dress would have. Okay, now we've got even new behaviors to be replacing, something we can take with us as we then find our radical middle going forward.
Yeah, and to me, this is all about exploring the edges of that creativity. And then also, frankly, it delves immediately into life happiness and satisfaction. And I know those are kind of loaded terms, but I think it's important to think about, what do you actually value in life? Because I think it's very rarely, Jill, that new dress. I think it's very rarely for me buying some little electronic gadget or trinket or something. Like, it almost never is, right? And I think because our dopamine centers have been hacked, like, I mean, no joke, I kid you not, this is like so perfect. In the last 30 minutes, I was on Facebook, which I try not to do, and they're always serving up ads. I literally click through, which I very rarely do. I'm like, oh, this little trinket could, I don't even want to talk about it because it's embarrassing. But like,
what was it, Brad?
Oh, man.
We all have it. We all have
Yes.
those things that we click through, like
Right?
everyone relates. Yeah.
Oh,
They're
man.
just so good. They are
Mhm.
so good at targeting. It used to be advertising was just like newspaper ads or radio ads, and you had to be there at the right time to get served the ad. Now you open your eyes and there's a targeted ad that's tailored to you. It's just a lot harder.
Yeah, you couldn't have nailed that even more with the word tailored, because mine was literally Taylor Swift inspired.
No way, yes.
Well, the last time we were on with you, you had taken your daughter to the Eras tour, I think.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I've been again since the last time I spoke with you
Whoa.
both. So
That's
I am
amazing.
I'm a full-on Swiftie at this point.
That's
Okay, so
awesome.
that's a
And
little
the
insight
internet knows.
into my algorithm here. But I think it's really important. So, Jill, you're talking about, right, the context for creativity. It's these parameters. But again, it's also, this to me is a deep understanding of yourself, right? And this is the hardest part about life. Like, inner work is really difficult, and it is not an overnight thing. This is a lifetime journey. It's a multi-decade journey, but it has to start somewhere, right? And I think, honestly, and I've seen this in my own life, that really questioning what I spend money on has helped my inner work journey. Because at the end of the day, I get down to, I need so little in my life. It is stunning when I think about it. Like, I'm also on a minimalism journey. So again, we'll probably talk about that later. But like, at this point, I could probably live on one suitcase. I have a couple of digital subscriptions because I want to watch my English Premier League soccer. I have a $15 a month gym membership, and I need some food. And frankly, I need connection, right? Like, that's actually what I crave. And you're able to do that over the internet now. You're able to, like, I'm able to travel a lot more often. So like, that's where I'm leading on these experiments. But I'd love to hear, like, where have your experiments taken you?
A couple of thoughts here and a tangible piece. First of all, I want to say that yes, it is a journey and it is about self-understanding, but I think it can be helpful to frame it as a kindness to ourselves and valuing ourselves, to give ourselves the opportunity to learn who we are, how we tick, how we operate, and recognize that we are morphing and changing. We're dynamic beings. The things that maybe we used to love or were fulfilling a decade ago are no longer that anymore. And allowing ourselves also the room to shift and change and redefine is important here. And I think, too, there's this concept that we talk about a lot of practicing curiosity, and really this stance of not knowing, approaching ourselves like a science experiment a little bit, and observing objectively as possible, not coming at it with a shaming perspective or a heavily questioning perspective, but rather, what is it about that activity that I like so much? What is it about spending on this that makes me feel fulfilled? Or if it's not fulfilling me, what am I trying to get at here? And for the tangible piece here, an experiment that we can all do is a 90-day transaction inventory. Like you said, looking at your spending can reveal a lot. And so we recommend going through the last 90 days of spending. So 3 months is going to give us a really good picture of the decisions that we make, some of the habits that we have, and maybe capture some of those outliers that might have existed. So gathering all of this into a spreadsheet and being able to look at, where am I spending the most money? The beautiful thing about spreadsheets is that we can organize them in all sorts of ways. We can organize by date, we can organize by location, we can organize by time frame and amount of money spent. However, we kind of want to run this experiment, so to speak, we can identify, where am I spending the most kind of discretionary money? What time of day is it? How might this help me understand the ways in which I impulse spend? And we can even create another column within this spreadsheet to journal a little bit, not lengthy. We're not writing paragraphs here, but to identify what came before this purchase. Can I remember what I was thinking or feeling or who I was with or the need that I thought that I was trying to meet by doing this? You don't have to ask all those questions, but pick what works for you. And what we're going to find is some observations rising to the surface of, okay, this is where I typically impulse spend. I'm apparently spending a lot when I'm feeling, certain types of emotions, whether I'm really happy, I was celebratory, or I was a little down in the dumps, or I felt like I was lacking connection and I went for these things. And just observing, just asking ourselves these questions, avoiding why questions, because why can put us in automatic fight mode, set us on the defense a little bit, but rather asking, what was it about this purchase? When was this purchase made? What did it do for me? And then that can inform our action. But there's so much self-understanding that's going to happen before we get to, okay, now what behaviors can I replace this with?
You're also going to be able to see if maybe you're spending a lot of money on other people versus yourself. Mm-hmm. So you're spending a lot on your kids and nothing on yourself, or for your family members and nothing on yourself, or in your business and nothing in your personal life. So it's going to reveal a lot of these other things too, even if you don't consider yourself like a superfluous spender.
Yeah, you both know we love nothing more at Choosify than actionable takeaways. Mm-hmm. So I think that 90-day transaction inventory, avoiding those why questions, but trying to get to, hey, where was I when this was happening? For everybody listening, that is a massive takeaway. I think that can dramatically improve your life if you do that. Now, I want to really, because I think stories make the world go round, honestly. And that's why I do try to dive into my own personal example pretty often, because I think sometimes people can take away just those little I would have never thought about that unless Brad said it or Jill or Jen. Are there any things that each of you have found in your own experimentation that you've been surprised by that has added value to your life?
So not in my life, but there's a story from the book that I really like telling that is a really good example. So our friend Paige, she started a new job right out of college. And she was so excited, as she started making money, she started buying new clothes for this new job. She was changing out her college wardrobe for her adult wardrobe, which was great. And then after a few months, realized she hates this job. And now she doesn't need to buy clothes anymore, but she continues to go on her lunch break and buy clothes, shoes, handbags, makeup, all this stuff, just to escape the job, just to get away. And she didn't realize what she was doing until a year in. And she was living with her parents, eating their food. She realized she had spent her entire $60,000 salary on stuff, just without realizing it. And so at the end, there was, a little inventory of transactions, right? Where did all this money go? And where she was able to pinpoint that it's these lunch breaks shopping trips. So then comes, a lot of you guys will be familiar with Atomic Habits and all of the cue. Yeah. So what we're really looking at is cues, right? Preceding event, person, place, time, stuff like that. So she identified 2 cues. The main one was her job, the location. So she immediately started looking for a new job, but she didn't find one overnight. So she had to find an alternative that was, she wanted to just get out on her lunch break. She couldn't leave altogether, so she could get out for an hour. That was really what she was after. And she just found herself at the mall. So instead, she started going to a park. She just brought her lunch and she took it to a park. So she was still able to escape for that hour a day, but she wasn't tempted to spend money. And so one day, and I love this part of the story, but she was like, one day I was just sitting under a tree at this park and the sun was shining and birds were chirping and it was this picturesque, beautiful scene. And she's like, what was I doing? Spending an hour a day inside a dingy mall, wasting my money when this is truly beautiful and fulfilling. And so eventually she did leave and she got to the major cue trigger, but she forced herself to get creative after she identified all these habits. And she wasn't even thinking about values-based spending at the time, but it was just looking at these tangible habits and getting creative with what she could change.
For me, I think similarly, shopping as an activity is one of the draws for impulse spending for me. I am accustomed to just on the weekends. It's how I grew up. My mom and I would go to the mall as teenagers. We would meet up at the mall. There wasn't a lot going on. So you just shop around and hope you had
2000s.
20 bucks in your pocket.
Yeah. How are we dating ourselves?
Yeah, exactly. And I still love it getting out of the house and kind of paired with the thrill of the hunt a little bit. I love digging, even at a thrift store. I love just digging through piles of stuff and finding the hidden gem. But it got to a point where I don't need this stuff, though, especially when I lived in a vehicle, essentially. I couldn't have more stuff. I needed to deal with the 4 bowls and the 2 forks that I had and move on with my life. And I think it has propelled me into this even continual years later, identifying new things to try. I think I'm a person who needs a decently high level of stimulation, I've learned about myself. And so I need different activity, but it doesn't mean that I have to go shopping. That now has become a little boring to me. I want something different. And so even just in the past year, I have engaged in new things that I have now found I really enjoy. I took up sourdough baking a little bit late to the party. I know everyone was doing it in 2020, but I did it in 2024. Yeah. I've been going with friends to trivia night and I joined a book club. I used to love reading and just detached from it for so long. And now with other people kind of getting together, chatting about something, identifying what we're going to read next gave me not just an activity to do through the month to engage in new resources, but people connection that I can get together with then monthly. And so I'm trying out all of these new things. None of it's costing me money thanks to the library. And I'm learning so much about myself and really actually fulfilling those higher needs in ways that actually hit the target rather than just trying to throw money to solve my problems.
I love that so very much. I think that is the kind of experimentation that we should all be doing. It's just trying to understand ourselves a little bit more and being creative, right? That's actually one of the backgrounds of FI in general. We're living just this slightly different life. Hopefully you don't feel deprived. That's how I've always thought of it, as this fun game that I get to play. Creativity is really the subtext of it. I rarely use that word, but that is the subtext, is I'm living the same middle or even upper middle class life as everybody around me, and I'm getting wildly wealthy at the same time. That's the fun stuff about FI, right? It's crazy.
For me, I think some of the joy is in identifying that it's the simple luxuries of life that are actually the most fulfilling, that it is not this extravagant lifestyle that I have to find, because like you said, it's not deprivation. It's really identifying, it's not these lavish things that bring me joy, contentment, peace. It's these simple pleasures that I identify work for me and bring me joy.
Yeah, it's not wanting less, it's wanting different and really targeting your want.
Oh, it's wanting different. Damn. A mic drop from Jen. Damn. We can just close up shop right now. That's amazing. Yeah. I think for me, I've found it's connection. That is the biggest point of differentiation in my life now compared with 10 years ago, let's say. But that's me. And you both have mentioned values-based spending a couple of times now. And in your book, you highlight something, the 4 Fs as key values. And I think this is the perfect time to tie into that because frankly, there might be somebody listening who, okay, yeah, they've heard us talk about creativity and figuring this out and experimenting and 90-day transaction inventory and all this stuff. But like, what if they're just kind of adrift right now and they don't know even where to start in terms of values-based spending?
Yeah, that's why we kind of coined the 4 Fs, because it can, values-based spending and figuring out what you value can feel like this really big, daunting task. And while it is a lifelong journey, it shouldn't feel like an overwhelming task. It's why we start with a 1-month no spend challenge, why we do a 90-day transaction inventory. I was actually talking with my husband last night and we're about to do one. And he's like, well, we should do a 1 year. Like we should just do the full year. And I was like, Travis, aside from the fact that I wrote a book on this, the goal is to get it done, not for it to be all encompassing and perfect. But he didn't listen to me because I'm his wife, not his personal finance author. So we start with manageable size tasks, right? And so the 4 Fs are family, friends, faith, and fulfilling work. And they are derived from that Maslow's hierarchy of needs I was talking about. So if you are not familiar with the hierarchy of needs, it's 5 levels. The first is food, water, shelter. Above it, we've got safety, consistency. So those are our basic needs. And in personal finance, we focus on those a lot. But our higher needs, which is what we like to focus on, are things that you're going to be pursuing even if your basic needs are not 100% met. Obviously, if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you're not going to be focusing on these higher needs. But if you're hungry and you know you can eat later and a friend asks you to, go get a drink or something, you can put off dinner for a while to go get that connection. So our next level is belonging, friendship, romantic relationships. Above that, we have self-esteem, respect, and that's where a lot of overspending, if we don't feel self-confident, then we will overspend on beauty, skincare, fitness, clothes, all these things to make ourselves feel better when really we need to be pursuing these other things on the hierarchy. And then at the very top, again, self-actualization, fulfillment, creativity, the feeling like you are living into your full human potential. That's a lot, right? So it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But we found in studies, when Americans at least are pursuing a quote unquote fulfilling life, the things that they mean in that tend to be relationships with family, relationships with friends and belonging, some kind of faith or spirituality practice. And that's where a lot of that self-actualization and passion come in. And then fulfilling work. And they actually said work and money. So we just combined those because we believe your fulfilling work shouldn't make you broke or poor, right? Your fulfilling work should pay you, but it should also make you feel like you're living into your full potential. So those are where to start. If you can base the way you're spending your money and your time and the way your physical spaces are set up, if you can arrange them to pursue those things first, then you have a much better chance of getting that dream life that you're picturing. And as you go on, you'll find different things that fall into there. But the 4 Fs are really, it's like that 80-20 principle. Like 80% of the time, it's going to be one of those 4.
And with this context, I think it can be helpful in doing that 90-day transaction inventory with some of those questions of what was this purchase trying to get at? Was I trying to meet one of my 4 Fs in buying this thing? I was just talking with somebody on the podcast recently who was describing that her online shopping was a very vulnerable moment for her to realize, oh my, I did just spend this week a lot of money on clothing that I saw people wearing on Instagram. I thought it looked so cute. They are kind of representing this lifestyle that I want. And all these friends are wearing this style of thing. She's like, I think I bought that to fit in, to try and belong, and to maybe hopefully be a part of this group or this club that how is that actually going to happen between these like digital
they don't even live in the
influencers?
City. Like,
yeah. And I think a lot of it can be very subconscious like that. But when we give ourselves the opportunity to ask these questions, it can feel vulnerable, but there is action that can be taken from there. And there's self-understanding that we can walk away with to know, okay, some of my spending might be to reach some of these esteem needs, these friendship and family and faith needs. Are there other ways that I could meet that actually meets the need rather than circumvents it? And then I feel bummed about the amount of money that I spent on it and wishing that I hadn't have bought that or shaming myself for it. But instead, how can this help me choose differently?
I love that as a starting point. So these 4 Fs. And I think looking at the hierarchy of needs is such an interesting exercise, I feel like, because this to me is one of maybe I don't know if paradoxes of FI might be the way to term this, but I feel like most people, and this is not to denigrate a wide swath of society, but like most people are just like trying to get through the day.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas one of the really fortunate aspects of those of us in the FI community who have some financial space, who aren't at that fight or flight stress every day of, do I have enough money to pay the bills? And that is not to minimize that. That is an ever-present stress for a significant portion of society, right? But those of us in the FI community, most of us are beyond that point. And then we get to move from those bottom 2 levels of the hierarchy up towards the top and even up towards self-actualization, right? And this to me is where the paradox comes in. It's like sometimes you can be more stressed because like you're so close to maybe what you see as like a perfection, if you will. And it reminds me of this book that I've read recently called The Gap and the Gain. So it's as opposed to focusing on the negative aspect of the gap between where you are and perfection, you miss the gain from where you started to where you are today. And I feel like this is a fundamental shift for me. But nevertheless, I think a lot of us, because we have these lives, a buddy of mine who I quoted on the podcast in 2017, it was, I never dreamed past here. Okay. And for a lot of us, right, we've never dreamed past where we are today. I think this would be kind of a fun launching point for a conversation because, right, like we're so fortunate, but yet a lot of us focus on what we're missing. And I just feel like we can do better and maybe we can help kind of lead that conversation.
I feel this so deeply. I have hit this point where I'm realizing, okay, life is short, yes, but sometimes it feels really long. And to recognize, oh my, I got to a certain point in my social work career that I thought was going to take me 20 years. And really, it took me 5. And then it's like, well, now what? Because I didn't think beyond that. And I know Jen and I have talked about debt payoff, okay, we're just going hard at this thing. And it's the only thing that we can see in front of us. And then we reach it, and it's not the nirvana that was promised to us. It's great. I'm really glad I accomplished it. But it doesn't solve all of my other problems. And in fact, now I've got to really hunker down and understand money in a real way to know what comes next after this. And I think this then is that call to the radical middle. I think it fits in a lot of contexts here of, okay, we've got a goal in mind, but let's also look at the bigger picture of our lives as well. And how can we still fulfill some of our needs in the here and now, honor the season that we're in, while we're working towards this goal, and not give every ounce of our time, energy, and attention to this one singular thing that we could find ourselves depleted on the other side of, or completely miss all of these other aspects of living a really beautiful life because we were so head down in the sand, so extreme on this one thing. But taking the holistic approach to it and identifying how can I weave in all these aspects of my personhood, all these aspects of the 4 Fs, and really find a lifestyle that fits for me now that I'm also willing to be fluid with in the future. Here's how it looks today, but I'm willing to make changes too in years down the road if need be.
Mm-hmm. And there is something to be said for singularity of focus, right? Mm-hmm. I love The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. Like, what's one thing you can do now which by accomplishing will make everything else easier or unnecessary in the future. And that is a route that we say, this is an important way to look at goals. But with that is a very seasonal approach and a short-term approach to things. And even that begs us to consider the future. We have to look at how our goal now in the short term impacts our future before we just blindly go accomplishing it. We always have to be checking back in as we are singularly focused on each of our goals. And again, realizing that it's the ends never justify the means. All we have are the ends, right? So that's a lot of the justification for people paying off debt or trying to retire early very quickly. The ends, they justify the means, whatever means necessary, but they don't, because really all we have is the journey. And so if your mindset is there, then you can have that singularity of focus with goals and not become isolated by them.
Yeah, I think this ties into so many things we've talked about, right? So Jill said before, we are dynamic beings. I think that's so important to remember is things change. Things are constantly changing. If you think you're going to set a plan in motion and it's going to be the exact same plan 15 years from now, that's just not the reality of life, right? It just isn't. And Jill, you also said it's not the nirvana I was promised, right? Whether this is debt-free, reaching FI, right? Reaching some number on a spreadsheet, I don't know, becoming CEO,
going to Bali,
right? Yeah. Oh, poor Bali. Bali was really great. Getting your business to 7 figures or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
There's no world. The three of us are here to tell you that is not the secret. It isn't the answer. That's not the lived reality of life. It just simply isn't. Life is a constant iterative process of trying to figure out, hey, what lights me up? Maybe in this season of life. And you're trying to get more directionally accurate, maybe holistically. But there are seasons of life, and we have to be okay with that. But if somebody thinks, this again is another maybe paradox, right? It's if you think your life is going to be this wonderful unicorns and rainbows, Shangri-La, when you hit your FI number, I am here to tell you that is not the way the world works. It just is not. Now, are you in a dramatically better spot when you've reached FI or when you're on the path to FI than when you started? Very obviously you are, right? There is no world where I'm going to say to anybody that following the path to FI isn't going to put you in a better spot. It is. But if you think that's the sole answer, it is not. It just isn't.
And if you think you can figure it out when you get there and ignore it on the way there, you can't.
Yeah. There is a research study that we referenced in the book about the amount of money that people think is going to make them happy. And what they did discover is, yes, as incomes increased to a certain extent, it did cause people greater levels of satisfaction. The previous study was at about $60,000, but now they've redone it and it's actually at about $500,000, and then you plateau, which does make a lot more sense to me now.
Yeah.
However, it only increases satisfaction to the degree that people were already satisfied and had these practices in place already. So the more money didn't make unsatisfied people satisfied. It's the practice of contentment, gratitude, finding what brings you joy along the way that can follow with you and carry on to, I'm finding my enough. And so I think that call, what you're describing here, is to say, while we are focused on goals, how can we also find these simple pleasures, these little luxuries of life that we can be engaging in that go with us whatever season of life that we find ourselves in? These ways of identifying, here's how I care for myself, here's how I value myself, here's how I engage in family, friends, faith, and fulfilling work, because that number in the bank account will shift. Hopefully it goes up. Sometimes it'll go down. But the things that are the constant that we have control over, I do think it's worth cultivating that for the long term.
It's truly that Adam Sandler SNL skit where he's the Italian tour guide and he's like, if you are not happy, Italy will not make you happy. If you are sad in America, you will be sad in Italy. If you are happy in America, you will be happy in Italy. And that is truly what it is with money.
Good summary, Jen.
That is amazing. Okay, we're going to need to dig that up and put that in the show notes.
I love that skit. It's so
Okay, you're going to help me find that. You're going to help me find that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this has been essentially the most important conversation we can have in our community. So thank you both for having it with me. I think this is so critical. As you know, of course, we always like to leave on actionable tips, right? So while the theory I think is so critical, like the hallmark of Choose a Buy has always been the actionable. So you talk in the book about saving smarter, not harder, and high impact strategies for saving on essential items and maybe even other things. So why don't we kind of land the plane here in terms of, are there specific tips that you could give somebody like, hey, I want to make a change in my life tomorrow? Just one thing. Like, where can they think about maybe making that high impact change?
So if you're thinking about a high impact change to actually like saving money, again, I love the 80-20 rule. So we've really tried to change frugality to be defined as good stewardship of your resources. That's money, time, natural resources, physical space, all of that, mental energy. And then in the traditional sense of frugality, the ways that you save money, we like to take an 80-20 approach. And so this can be really freeing, especially for a lot of people in the FI community who really want to hold money close in everything, and realizing that Americans, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, spend most of their money in just 3 categories. It's 80% if you include 4, but the 4th category is investing. So we don't want to lower that.
Yeah.
So we'll look at the top 3, which is about, I would say like 60, 70. It is housing, transportation, and food. So if you focused on just those 3 things and keeping those 3 things in check, you wouldn't have to worry about any other expense. No coupon, no rebate apps, no BOGO sales. Nobody cares. It's fine. You could buy all the sustainable and local everything, and it would be fine if you just kept those 3 areas in check and realize no expense is quote unquote fixed. Everything can be creatively reworked.
I like the sound of that.
So you may not be able to change your housing situation tomorrow, but it could be something worth looking at. We don't want to assume, well, that's fixed, so what else can I do? Let's look at it. And it may be that you decide, yeah, I'm going to stay here. This makes the most sense for me. But there's also people who, when they give themselves the opportunity to question it, can realize, actually, I don't think I want to be a homeowner anymore. It's not the nirvana that was promised to me. And it actually costs so much more than I ever would have thought that it would have cost. And maybe, oh, I really love living in this area, but I don't actually have to live in this neighborhood. Or what if I did take that job in another state and try out another area with possibly a lower cost of living? So that is possible. And also looking at, if you are looking at buying a house, the price point that you are looking at purchasing that house at. Eric and I bought our house off of my salary alone, a pre-approval off of my salary. So very conservatively for the 2 of us. And so it's these types of decisions that can help us in the long term rather than, okay, yeah, I like the houses that are $300,000, but then we get talked into a $350,000 home, and just that extra $50,000 over the life of the loan, depending on our interest rate, could mean hundreds of thousands of dollars that we are then not able to invest and grow our money. So really being strategic about a housing decision. And then, of course, like Jen said, with transportation, do we have to have the cars that we have? Do we have to have multiple vehicles? My husband and I, now granted, we work from home, but we only have 1 vehicle. Well, we have 1 car. We have 2 scooters. And that's very fun. Talking about simple pleasures of life, riding that scooter around downtown. And that works for us because we live in kind of a metro area. So we're able to, if even both of us need to go different directions, one can take the scooter, the other can take the car. And then, of course, food. And there's all sorts of things you can do with
That's a
that.
whole
From
nother
meal
episode.
planning, meal prep. That is
That's a whole other,
a whole other episode.
200 episodes. And
But
we've
that
got
is
about
something you
200 of
could
them.
start tomorrow.
Mhm.
These
Yeah.
other decisions are made every 5 to 15 years, but food decisions are made daily. So if you're looking for something actionable in the immediate, looking at your food purchases and ways that you can decrease costs there would be ideal.
Mhm.
Yeah, totally agreed. That's the low-hanging fruit of the
Yeah.
big 3 expenses. You can start on that tomorrow with meal planning, start cooking at home a little bit, just be intentional, I think would be my biggest advice. I think most people are reflexively, hey, it's 5:45, we're driving home, and what do we do now? Right?
Yeah.
That's when you make poor decisions. So it's just like anything in life. It's long-term thinking. It's just looking a little bit down the field to making a positive decision. And Jill, I love it's not the nirvana that was promised to me. I think
Yeah.
that's the takeaway from American society at large, right? It's like, as a total random aside, I
I'm
don't
so sorry.
think
That's a takeaway.
no, that's the tongue-in-cheek takeaway. But
We're all a little jaded at
Yeah,
this
yeah.
point in our decades of life.
Yep. 2024.
yeah, the year of being jaded. No, yeah, I don't think I'll ever own a home again. Like I as you were describing that, I'm like, oh, it just doesn't appeal to me. It's just not the thing.
I was thinking the same, like, even if you do want to own a home, maybe owning a second or third, or maybe being a landlord is not for you.
Mhm.
Like I am finding out.
Yeah.
So I'm
That
on
was
that journey.
a big one in our personal finance
Uh-huh.
community. You know, get
Yep.
your duplex,
I
get your
experimented,
quadplex.
and
It works for some people,
works for some people.
and it
but
is
for
not
everyone.
for everybody.
No.
It is not, and that's okay. I think, right? Like maybe that's where the takeaway we leave with is it's okay to experiment and just find out something isn't for you.
Mhm.
You've
Yeah.
learned something. That's not a failure. It means you've learned something about yourself. It means you've learned something about the world, and that is a win as far as I'm concerned. Life is a series of experiments, hundreds and thousands of them, and you're just learning a little bit more about yourself every single time. Jen, Jill, you two rock. I love chatting with you. Love, love, love. Thank you so much for coming on. So, okay, I'm going to try to fill in the blanks. People can find you obviously at the Frugal Friends podcast. They're listening to a podcast now on a podcast player. Just search for Frugal Friends. They're amazing.
Yeah.
And the book is coming out January 7th, everywhere books are found. So buy what you love without going broke. And we will obviously have a link in the show notes. Is there anything else that you want to send people to, or are those the 2 spots?
Well, I think I would just add, like, yes, if you feel like you want to improve how you spend money, the book will be great. But even if you don't feel like that's where you're at, we're hoping to usher in this new perspective in personal finance. Exactly what you've been here, like listening to for the last hour, that we feel like a lot of this conversation is missing from the business and investing bookshelf. We want to usher in that conversation. And the only way more writers with similar voices will get heard is if this book does well. So I would encourage you to buy a copy and give it to a friend that wants to buy what they love without going broke. And yeah, let's further this conversation for decades to come through not just our voices, but a lot more diverse voices.
I love that. Absolutely love that. Thank you both again for coming on. And to everyone, get this book. It's really great. It's genuinely great. I read it and really enjoyed it. So until next time, thanks for listening and being part of the Choosify community.